Hello there, and a very warm welcome. I'm Brian Taylor, and this is my latest Herald podcast. Now, before we get going with the guests, first a wee plug. To get all the Herald's brilliant content, well, you should subscribe, shouldn't you? And you can get a cracking discount of 20% by mentioning the code at the bottom of the page now. That's Herald Pod 2021. It is Herald Pod 2021. Apparently, if you bung that in, you get 20%. That's a fifth off in old money from a subscription. I encourage you to do exactly that. Now to the show, and a rather special one, because the Scottish Parliament returns next week. It's been returning fairly periodically and sporadically because of the bizarre summer we've had, but it returns in full form next week. And it looks like we'll have a new green tinge to the government. We'll talk about that in a moment. But Alistair Grant, my Herald colleague, Herald political correspondent, is here. Alistair, bring us up to date with the latest, please, if you would.
Yeah, just to, I suppose, just sum up quite quickly, we've obviously had the long-awaited publication of the planned cooperation agreement between the SNP and the Greens last week. This will essentially see them kind of sharing a policy programme with the two co-leaders, Patrick Harvie and Lorna Slater, becoming ministers in the Scottish Government. However, it kind of stops short of being that full coalition like we've seen kind of elsewhere in the UK in the past, and the kind of early years of Holyrood, of course, with the Liberal Democrats and Labour. But they've got kind of areas where the two parties have agreed to disagree. So stuff like the kind of role of GDP, aviation policy, international relations, those kind of things. But we've also got a number of kind of areas where they've kind of almost kind of had this kind of shared policy programme with things like, on the environment, active transport, kind of child poverty, measures to tackle that. But we've got this agreement. We've had it confirmed today that the responsibilities of the new Green ministers will be, one will be kind of covering transport, housing, tenants' rights, and the other will be covering energy, green skills, and the natural environment. I'm assuming, I don't know if I'm right about this, but I'm assuming the latter would be Lorna Slater, considering her kind of background in green energy. That was her job before she entered politics. But one of the kind of final hurdles, I guess, will come this weekend when the Green members will be meeting up to vote on the deal on Saturday. And if it all goes through and it all goes smoothly, I guess we'll see a kind of a new chapter open up in Scottish politics. We never had Greens in power in the UK before, so it'll be interesting to see what happens next.
Alistair, it will indeed. The final hurdle was a Dundee United fanzine. It meant that we hadn't won the cup, but we've actually now won the Scottish Cup twice. And Patrick Harvie, I'm delighted to say that Patrick joins us, and he's beaming there like the putative, I stress, putative minister that he is, but tentative potential congratulations, Mr. Harvie. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Tell me one thing. Alistair mentioned there GDP, gross domestic product. That's the measure by which the economy grows. And we with a statement today from Kate Forbes, Finance Secretary, backing fair and sustained economic growth and stressing that unless you get that growth, you ain't got no potential to have public spending. But you guys, the Green guys, you take a different view of that. You don't really believe in economic growth, at least as far as the GDP measure is concerned. How are you going to manage to square that in government?
Well, thanks for inviting me onto the podcast, Brian, and thanks for the slightly premature congratulations. The matter is, as you know, still in the hands of our party members, and we have a little while yet till we get a final decision. But yeah, for as long as the Green movement has existed, there has been a fundamental challenge to the idea. Well, two ideas. First of all, the idea that economic growth can last forever on a planet of finite resources. We think that's wrong. And secondly, the idea that GDP, gross domestic product, is an effective way of measuring how healthy and how successful our economy is. GDP is a measure of the transactions in our economy. Effectively, it counts all of the good stuff and all of the bad stuff that's happening and just calls it stuff. And it says we just need constantly more stuff whirling around the economy. So there are many, many forms of activity which undermine people's health and well-being, but which contribute to GDP. Now, don't get me wrong, there's a lot that GDP counts that's important, that's good for people, and that's good for communities. But as a metric, it doesn't distinguish between what is socially and environmentally benign and what is harmful. If cigarette sales go up, that increases GDP.
It's possible to measure GDP. You've just described the flaws you see in it, but you're talking about something like well-being or wellness, and it strikes me that is so inchoate and imprecise that you can't measure it in the comparable way that you can measure gross domestic product.
Well, a number of governments have tried, including, I see Stephen Kerr nodding away with your criticism there. The Conservative government was open to this.
Head like nobody's business on your earlier stuff as well, but there we go.
The Conservative government under David Cameron was keen on this idea of finding other ways of measuring the economy. So it's not purely a left critique. It's something that politicians and economists right the way across the spectrum have struggled with. Now, the Scottish government has made steps. Ever since they first came into power, the SNP created what's called the National Performance Framework. It's a little bit abstract. It's probably never going to make front page headlines, but is an attempt to construct a broader set of outcomes, a broader set of measures that you're trying to achieve, and that's what you define success as. Okay. Now, we still criticize it because it has GDP growth at the pinnacle of that framework, and we still regard that as essentially unsustainable. The closer you get to environmental limits, the faster you run after economic growth, the more harm that you do. But a well-being economy is the direction that I think we're moving in.
Patrick, I'll bring in the others in a second, but one question, it may seem a bit trivial, but in some ways it summarises the fact that Greens are entering government. Will you make use, if you're endorsed at the weekend, if you're elected and next week by Parliament, will you make use of ministerial cars as a minister?
Mate, you're the second journalist to ask me that just today. I will do exactly what I do at the moment, which is I will always try to use active travel as my first choice and public transport as my second choice. And I will use a car if I absolutely need to. Tomorrow for a party visit, I'm taking the bike to Queen Street and then the train to Edinburgh. And then I'm going to get a lift for the last 15, 20 minutes of the journey because there's no public transport to the place I'm going to. So Greens want to invest in public transport so that it serves more of our communities. But we always recognise that there is a place for the car, but it's in the right context and when it's necessary. So, if the party agrees that we should enter government, I think you will see us taking exactly the same approach. Use a car when it's absolutely necessary, if there's no alternative, but you'll still see me on my bike getting about Glasgow. That's
the way. Well, there's two of you. Get a ministerial tandem. I'm joined now by Stephen Kerr, who got a name check earlier. Delighted also to welcome Alex Cole-Hamilton. Now, I can actually genuinely congratulate him, the new leader of the Scottish Liberal Democrats. Congratulations.
Thank you, Brian. Thanks so much.
Conservative Chief Whip Stephen Kerr, by Cockab Stewart, delighted to welcome her to the SNP MSP for Glasgow, Kelvin, and by Labour MSP Martin Whitfield. Thanks all. Stephen Kerr, you win the Mars bar for looking the most vigorously disquieted during Patrick Harvey's comments. What do you make of this agreement between the Greens and the SNP, and what do you make of its potential impact on the economy?
Well, the last thing that I need, Brian, is a Mars bar. I'm trying to give up Mars bars, but thank you for offering me any sort of recognition.
In these modern days, it's a digital Mars bar. So
digital. Yeah. I think probably the calorie count in a digital Mars bar is in line with my dietary requirements.
What do you make of the deal?
I shake my head at the stuff comment from Patrick. Stuff. That's what the economy is. It's just stuff. Well, it's not, Patrick. It's people's jobs, it's people's incomes, it's livelihoods, it's tax, it's business creation and business scale up. Things that will add to the commonwealth of the people of Scotland, and for them to be dismissed as stuff, it shows exactly where the Greens and the SNP are heading in terms of their view.
I think it shows that you weren't really listening to what I was saying. I was saying that's the simplistic critique of economic growth as GDP.
And what I heard was you describe our economy as just a bunch of stuff. Well, I think people will be concerned about that. And I shudder at the news that Alistair Grant brought us, that one of the Green MSPs is going to be responsible for transport. Well, that's the death knell to every bit of infrastructure investment that's badly needed in Scotland in order to grow our economy, increase our productivity, things like investment in roads, etc., and energy. Well, this is so on the economy, the Scottish Greens are the only party maybe in Britain that wants to shrink the economy, wants us to scale back the economy, wants to put the economy into permanent recession. And on energy, they're not interested in net zero. They want zero. They want no emissions. And what they're not prepared to be is pragmatic about any of this stuff. And so,
okay, let's be pragmatic then. We'd like to double the onshore wind industry. Do you want to help us?
That's 110,000 jobs directly employed in the oil and gas sector.
You can hang on a second, very briefly, Patrick, and then I'm keen to bring in the other so that it isn't just an interrogation in one minute.
Stephen is asking me to be pragmatic. One of the very practical things we want to do on energy is double the onshore wind capacity. Will his party help us to achieve that, or will they do what they did before and pull the rug from under the most efficient and most cost-effective way of generating renewable electricity? Will you help us double that?
Hold that thought. The others are all have been all very patient. Alec Cole-Hamilton, first of all, what do you make of this agreement and the impact upon the economy, the impact upon Scotland?
Well, Brian, I think reading it seems like pretty thin gruel for the Green Party. I congratulate Patrick on his elevation to ministerial office, but I rather think that it will leave some of his members scratching their head as to what's really in it for their party. And let's remember, the centrepiece of this agreement is not the climate emergency. It is another tilt at a divisive second independence referendum, which inexplicably comes with the Greens. I don't understand what it is about the Green Party and nationalism. I think that if you want to fight climate change, you need to do it across borders and forge partnerships. And as for GDP and growth is not something to be frightened of. Growth drives progress. It drives innovation. And innovation is the key to fighting the climate emergency. My cousin is a professor at Oxford who's working in geoengineering to look at ways that we can extract carbon from the atmosphere, but also about how we innovatively drive down our reliance on fossil fuels. So all of these things require investment, which comes from growth. And I don't think we should be scared of a healthy GDP.
Let's bring in Martin Whitfield and then Cockab Stewart. Martin, the deal and the impact on Scotland's economy.
Well, again, to echo something that Alex has said and to take it slightly further, I'm not sure what we'll see particularly different. We've seen in the past sessions where the Greens have run around and screamed and shouted and then supported the budget. I was disappointed, I have to say, that the agreement didn't discuss our drug deaths, the alcohol deaths, and the health emergency that we're facing. I have long supported the talks and the work that the Green Party have done, particularly with regard to drug deaths. And I think it's disappointing not to have seen that carried forward. And I do wonder, with all respect, Patrick, whether your membership, and it is for your membership, obviously, whether they will be really happy about this agreement and whether we will actually see any genuine change in holding to account once you are in government, where responsibility will also rest with you.
We'll learn the view of the party, of course, on Saturday, and then if it passes that hurdle, there'll be, one presumes, a motion by the First Minister and votes on the two new ministers who will be part of a wider government and will also be taking the wider ministerial responsibility. Cockab Stewart, you've been very patient indeed. How do you think this works from an SNP perspective? What's the gains? It gets you over the line, presumably for a majority, but I don't see it makes any difference at all on independence, because the Greens were going to vote for it anyway. So what's the gain? What's in it for the SNP?
Well, Brian, thanks very much. It's great to be here, and as a newly elected MSP, maybe I can sort of give a view from the outside, not having been elected before. So it's quite an interesting arena, this. And I was just going to say, if people could maybe not speak over each other, because I can't hear, I'm losing the thread of it myself. So I'll try not to do that. With regards to the Green Cooperation Agreement, I'm really excited by that, because I've sort of watched from the outside the way that politics has been conducted and the entrenched views that can happen, and I'm not sure that the public sees that as entirely constructive. So in order for us to move forward and to be able to cooperate on certain issues in order to move bills or legislation or the vision of the country forward in a more consensual way and a collegiate way, I think that that's very helpful.
It could be said, Cockab, it could be said it does precisely the opposite. That at the present moment, you have a parliament of all the talents and all the arts, and for something to get through as a bill, it has to command support across a broad range of parties, whereas now, and I've looked at the details of it, for bills, legislation, and also amendments in committee, the two parties, the SNP and the Greens, are going to vote together, and that cuts out everybody else. It cuts out ideas from the Conservatives, the Liberal Democrats, and Labour.
It doesn't cut out the scrutiny at all. And remember, the SNP and the Greens are very distinct parties. The cooperation agreement clearly allows for the distinct nature of our parties. Whilst we will try and reach consensus and have agreement on certain things, I have no doubt whatsoever that the robust nature of the debates that already happen in the chamber will continue to happen.
Yeah, the robust debates will happen, but the Conservatives, Labour and the Liberal Democrats will always lose, because now there is a predetermined SNP Green majority, and it's not just on the big policy issues, it's on the detail of legislation and on amendments to legislation. There's been a whole pile of amendments in the past Parliament that were got through by opposition parties.
Yeah, but Brian, I think you're coming from the old sort of like view of the fact that no matter what somebody says, people are going to stick to party lines and things. From what I can see, people are willing to consider amendments, and there appears to be a lot of negotiations and things that go on. So that consensus can happen before. It doesn't have to be as adversarial as it is.
Okay, I've got a hand raised, and it's Alec Cole-Hamilton. I've got a hand raised after that, Stephen Kerr, and then Patrick. Alec Cole-Hamilton, then Stephen, then Patrick, please.
Yes, Brian, I'm afraid that you're absolutely right. The legislation will now go through unamended and untested. I mean, the Scottish Parliament was designed as a unicameral legislature. What does that mean? Well, it's only one chamber. It doesn't have a revising chamber like a Senate or the House of Lords south of the border. It was always felt that the committees would be the revising chamber. And we saw from the majority term of administration under the SNP that legislation just went through on the nod. There's this nice, pleasant fiction that Corcab is talking about, that we will consider every amendment on its merits, is hogwash. That doesn't happen. This is a controlling, commanding administration which likes to have its way, and if it's not its idea, it won't countenance change. So I think this points to a problem in the structure of the Scottish Parliament, and arguably a need for reform.
Okay, I got to Stephen Kerr next, and then to Patrick. Yeah, Stephen.
Yeah, I'm going to come in on what Alex has just said. This is actually going to show up the weaknesses of the Scottish Parliament in terms of its ability to hold the executive to account. This is not a new phenomenon. It was very evident in the last session that was the case. I'd also like to say there are really serious implications for the operation of Parliament in terms of what happens in the chamber as well. So, for example, at the moment, the Greens have got a preferential place every week in FMQs. Well, you can't be in the government and the opposition. And I really want to knock on the head this idea that this is not a coalition. This is a coalition. That's exactly what it is. And no matter how much Nicola Sturgeon tries to pretend that with her higher intellect, we should all understand what she's talking about. Remember that line from the summer? Well, let me say this. I perfectly understand, as do the people of Scotland. This is a coalition between the SNP and the Greens, and therefore the Greens cannot be in government and in opposition at the same time. Therefore, they must lose preferential treatment. They must lose preferential speaking slots in debates. And this is a test for the vibrancy of our Parliament as a place where the executive is tested and held up to scrutiny. And it'll be interesting to see what happens in the next few days and weeks.
Thanks, Stephen. Patrick, quite a lot to absorb there. How about all of that? Patrick, we're not hearing you. Oh yeah, on you go. Yep, please.
Yeah, Stephen knows very well that we've never had preferential treatment. We're treated equally as all political parties are, and these decisions are for the presiding officer. The presiding officer will continue.
Forgive me. Will you still be able to pose questions to the First Minister, even though you'll be in her government?
That will be for the presiding officer to decide, and even SNP backbenchers do get to ask questions at First Minister's question time from time to time. Not ministers, no. Not ministers, but SNP members do get the chance to ask questions of the First Minister and of other ministers. So look, the wider point that I would like to deal with.
Hang on, Patrick Harvey.
The wider point that I would like to deal with is, and it is a little odd to hear this critique coming from Conservative and Lib Dem colleagues, this idea that a single party majority is outrageous when they worked together to form a single party majority at Westminster not so long ago.
That was
And,
subject
Alex
to the
Cole-
revising
and Alex
chamber
Cole
of the
Hamilton's-
House of Lords.
And Alex Cole Hamilton's party was in a two-party majority for 8 years in the first two sessions
It
of
was
the
a
Scottish
coalition,
Parliament.
Doesn't mean
Patrick.
the problem doesn't exist.
All
Patrick.
the way along, whatever the format of the government, the willingness of ministers to engage across party has been varied. When there was a coalition, some ministers were good at it and some ministers just batted off any idea that came from the opposition parties. When the SNP were in power, some of their ministers have been good at it and some of them have been bad at it. I think it's always good for ministers to have an open mind, to work across party lines where they can. And if I have the opportunity to serve in that capacity, that's the way I'll work, absolutely. And it would be a breath of fresh air from the last 6 months before the election, which were so hostile, so toxic, so polarized, and riven with the kind of the attitude of online conspiracy theorists brought into the chamber in the tone of the debate that some people were bringing. That was so ugly. What we want to see is political parties working together to make life better for people in Scotland.
Thanks for that. Stephen Kerr and then Martin Whitfield. Stephen, then Martin, please.
So the examples that Patrick cites are coalitions. So I think we've had tacit acceptance from Patrick just now that what we've got with this agreement is a coalition government. And therefore that does change the shape of the preferential speaking rights in the chamber. And he shakes his head, but he just compared this current scenario with the 2010 Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition government at Westminster.
I compared that scenario with what you'd been saying. And nobody gets preferential treatment. You just know that's not true.
In debates, you get opening and winding up speeches. And
Let's bring in Martin.
As do all the other parties. There's nothing preferential.
No,
Martin Whitfield.
Let the debate abate slightly so that everyone can be heard. I think the difficulty that you have, Patrick, is that you are mixing up two aspects of the Scottish Parliament. Firstly, in the sense that the De Hoyt system dictates the speeches and the breakdown of speeches across parties. But then you are convalescing that with the fact that you are going into government. And when we come to debates and we have openings by ministers and closing by ministers, then within that format, your party is sitting on the side of government. You talk about reaching out across the chamber. And I think when you look at some of the work that happens in committee stage, that's exactly what does happen. And that's where the reaching out. The cross-party groups I was talking about this morning at a conference are another fine example of it. But I think it is very dangerous to hold up what the expectation is that everything will be agreed across the whole chamber, because that won't happen. And the rules that sit to dictate who talks, when they talk, who can question, who can hold to account, are there to facilitate the very founding principles of the Scottish Parliament, and that is to hold the government to account.
I haven't set out any expectation there. Those issues will be for the PO to decide, as you know. But I would hope, Martin, that you see some real positive opportunities in at least some of this. We're going to see a national system of rent controls. Labour has been calling for that at UK level for a number of years. The SNP have agreed to do this because Greens have been in the room making the case for it. I've been personally making the case for at least 3 or 4 housing ministers worth of engagement. And now finally we've got the opportunity to do that. And if I have the opportunity to reach out to Labour colleagues and say, how do you want to help shape this? I hope that'll be a positive engagement and a constructive one.
Thanks for that. I'm going to bring in Alistair Grant. Alistair, I want to take us down a slightly different area, but an area, big in the things that developed this week. We had an announcement about a COVID inquiry, and we had an announcement about proposals for the NHS. So you've got COVID and you've got post-COVID NHS. Remind us of what's been happening on those fronts, please.
Yeah, so earlier this week, as you said, we had this announcement that Scotland will begin its own judge-led public inquiry into the coronavirus pandemic by the end of the year. It will basically aim to kind of scrutinise the decisions that were taken over the course of the pandemic. I think, the First Minister said it will look at all the aspects and the kind of devolved handling of it, including the kind of situation in care homes. It's obviously a kind of an issue of huge controversy and affecting families up and down the country. Of course, one of the things we don't know is how long an inquiry would last. These things do tend to take quite a long time. And I think given the sheer volume of information surrounding the coronavirus crisis, I think the expectation is that it would take quite a while. But it's nevertheless, it's a welcome development for campaigners. I think some of them are actually quite emotional on hearing the news. They understandably want answers both for themselves and for other people.
Yeah.
And we've also got Boris Johnson, who's committed to holding a kind of UK-wide or UK public inquiry.
And the initial thought had been perhaps that the Scottish elements might have gone into that wider UK one on the grounds that so much of the effort was pan-UK, and so many of the issues were affected by cross-border decisions.
Yeah, I think it's not quite clear, how the Scottish inquiry might feed into this, although Nicola Sturgeon was also saying that it's important there's not duplication or overlap. At the same time as all this, you touched on it yourself there, we've got issues with the health service, we've got...
I want to talk about that.
I mean, essentially, it's kind of... I suppose earlier this week, again, we had the Scottish Government publishing its £1 billion plan to address the NHS backlog, kind of promising to increase healthcare capacity, reforms across kind of doctors, dentists, hospital services. But
let's bring in Kokab Stewart. Kokab, we have the COVID inquiry, but I'm in some ways that'll take its own shape. And I mean, Harold Wilson said these inquiries tended to take minutes and waste years, but we shall see with this one. And I understand entirely the anxiety of the relatives to get to the core. What about that announcement on health spending? I mean, in some ways, I was most struck by not the additional money, because the health service will always absorb money available. It was linked to reform, wasn't it? To a different way of trying to bring about healthcare. Kokab, would you take us through that, please?
Yeah, talking about the reform of it, I think is very important, not to underestimate the impact of the money and the £1 billion commitment to that. But looking at how we deliver services, I think like anything else, COVID exposed lots of things, and the backlog in operations, just getting access to GPs. There's loads of different ways, cancer care, I could list lots of things, I won't, but the general principle of it, I suppose, is that the system does need reform. We need to look at how we best use our staffing, how we recruit those staff, how we maintain them and retain them as well. Looking at the mental and health and well-being, the mental health services, I suppose that's as well. The big sort of like investment in that, which I really welcome. So we've got the medical stuff that we're, the bones and the blood and everything, but also looking at mental health services. And I've met with lots of sort of like agencies that are involved in that, and they're very welcoming of that. So
will we see a real change, Kokab? Will we see real change? Because I mean, there's been so many new initiatives for the NHS, different structures, additional funding, again and again and again, and it doesn't seem to change all that much in terms of the way the service is delivered.
Yeah, I can see why you might say that. I'm sort of like learning as I'm coming in that, from the outside, it's like, why is change not happening? And then when you get onto the inside of it and you see that, you can understand a wee bit why, because like so many of the different services are connected with each other. So whilst you've got the NHS, you can't, that's health policy, but that has a knock-on effect on social policy. It has a knock-on effect on economic policy as well. So housing, all these things are interconnected. So I'm glad that the inquiry is going to take its time over it and to explore all the issues that are nuanced, they're quite in depth, and I hope it takes a human rights-based approach to it as well. So not just looking at the numbers, but also looking at the impacts on particularly like marginalized, underrepresented groups. I've had representations from many groups, with sort of their own unique set of medical circumstances, but also from ethnic minorities, from children, from homeless, from all that point of view. I do hope that I am optimistic that change will come. We have the most.
Just forgive me, just briefly on the inquiry. Is it likely to produce some awkward moments for Scottish ministers?
Well, I don't think that the Scottish minister, I watched it, from sort of like home while we were during that period. And I don't think the ministers were ever saying we've got this right. In fact, as I heard Nicola Sturgeon saying it many times.
Jean Freeman quite famously saying we got it wrong on care.
Sorry?
Jean Freeman quite famously saying called it wrong on the transfer to care homes.
Yeah, and I think that, you have to be able to own up to errors that were made, and I can't make any comment on that because I wasn't in the situation, didn't have access to all the information. However, I think that, if people reflect on it, and the information is changing all the time, I bear that all in mind. But is it so bad to have uncomfortable moments where you can look back and think, could have done it differently, could have done it better, and that equips us better for the future? And that's a bit more grown up than being frightened to make mistakes and getting a pan in from oppositions. Thanks,
Kokab. Let's bring in some other Stephen Kerr, the COVID inquiry, and above all, perhaps the new direction that is being mapped out for the NHS. Are you convinced?
Well, first of all, I'm delighted to be able to tell you that so much of what Kokab said I can agree with. So I'm following Patrick's encouragement there that we can work together on things that are of absolute vital national interest, and nothing is of more pressing national interest right now than the remobilisation and recovery of the NHS. So I'm glad that we've been pressing as Scottish Conservatives for a COVID inquiry. There is a consultation on this now. There needs to be action on it. The commitment is that the inquiry should be set up before the end of the year, and that's very much what we hope will happen. But I have to say, on the NHS pamphlet that was produced, I'm afraid 100 days ago, or plus 100 days, because actually, in actual fact, the SNP ability to count to 100 was called into question in the timing of the 100 days, which is another issue. But to produce after 100 days, by the SNP's reckoning, a 28-page document with lots of white space and lots of graphics is thin gruel. I think that was a phrase that used earlier. On such
another phrase that was used.
matter,
Nicola Sturgeon said your complaints were ludicrous.
Well, of course, everything that anyone ever says to the First Minister that she disagrees with ends up being described by her as ludicrous, which is the antithesis of the working together and listening to each other that Patrick was espousing earlier. So good luck, Patrick, with disagreeing with the First Minister when you're a minister in the government. But this should have been, after 100 days, something that would have had a lot more detail, because this is absolutely a critical issue. Now, the Cabinet Secretary for Health and Social Care himself said, and I asked him about this in the chamber in a debate that we had on the NHS recovery plan, which we were still waiting to see, and now we've seen it's 28 pages, as I say, and he said that it would take many years for the NHS to recover. Now, this has got to be put into the context of the NHS, the SNP's commitment at the election, that in the first year of government, that they would restore the NHS not only to its capacity levels pre-COVID, but plus 10%. So straight away, the 100 days has produced a broken promise in respect to this particular commitment. And there are so many things that we need to work together on, and nothing is more important than this. I mean, we are facing this backlog issue that Kokab mentioned is a huge issue. And in one specific area I want to mention, because I feel very strongly about this, is mental health.
Yeah.
Where people in Forth Valley, which is part of my Central Scotland constituency, can be waiting for 2 years. Young people can be waiting for 2 years to see mental health specialists, and that is shameful. What we are dealing with now is a lack of workforce planning and a lack of planning full stop from the SNP government going back many years, in fact, going back to Nicola Sturgeon's time as the Cabinet Secretary for Health. And what we need to do now is get into the nitty-gritty and develop a detailed plan that will actually deliver on the headlines that we got in the 28-page pamphlet.
Okay, let's bring in Martin Whitfield, then Alex, and then Patrick. You've been very patient for a while. Briefly, if you would, on the health issue and the COVID issue. Martin.
I mean, certainly dealing with the health issue. You know, the publication was as underwhelming as it was overdue. But what I did find disappointing was the complete lack of explanation to existing staff about how they are going to be supported back. They have worked, they were applauded, they have saved so many people, and now they've just been abandoned. There is talk of additional staff coming in, but training for doctors, 6 years, training for nurses, 4.5 to 5 years, training for support staff. We've talked about the mental health and the importance of it. As a school teacher, I witnessed pupils waiting 18 months and plus, moving from primary school to high school before they were seen by CAMHS. The training for the specialist staff that's needed isn't even going to be complete by the end of this Parliament. And we have let down the NHS. And by doing that, the Scottish Government, the SNP, have let down the people of Scotland. This was a massive opportunity and it's been missed. And we have now sitting on top of that, the proposals for the COVID inquiry. And, you know, I will put my personal interest hat on in this. And they're asking for comments on the areas that are going to be looked at. And one of those is education. And we look at the debacle that has been in education. We look at the people who will remember this COVID outbreak for longer than certainly anyone on this podcast, but for the longest for people in society. And they will look back, and I fear they will do so with disappointment at the politicians and the way that they
wasn't a uniquely difficult set of circumstances that would have been challenging.
Absolutely, it was a deeply difficult. No, absolutely, it was a deeply difficult set of circumstances. It still is. It still is for people who are shielding at home. It still is for people who aren't sure where their employment is going. But that doesn't mean that politicians can duck and dive and just go, I'm sorry, I've learnt about it. There are families who are grieving and will grieve for the rest of their lives. And it is wrong. It is fundamentally wrong for politicians to try and step away from their responsibility in making decisions, in taking decisions, and listening to the advice that was available at the time and then not acting on it.
Got that. Bring in Alec Cole-Hamilton, then bring in Patrick Harvey. Alec Cole-Hamilton.
I just want to address one particular thing that Martin said about child mental health, and it is a very welcome recognition of the problems in child mental health services, and that the SNP has promised to clear those waiting lists by 2023. But that cannot mean parking young people on medication or offering them inferior interventions online, when actually a lot of these young people need access to talking therapy by psychiatry. Okay. That's a red line for us. In terms of the recovery plan itself, again, very underwhelming. I think I was more concerned with what it didn't mention. It didn't mention anything about the NHS treatment time guarantee. We've got patients who, even before the pandemic, were clutching letters saying they'd be seen in 12 weeks when there wasn't a hope of them seeing in 50. And that is not addressed by this. Now, it was convenient for the SNP to use the pandemic to explain why operations are being delayed or cancelled. They were terrible before we'd even heard of coronavirus. So we need a catch-up plan to get back to the races on at least being honest with people about when they'll be seen. And then secondly,
you said convenient. Are you saying they used it as an excuse?
No. I misspoke there. I don't mean to suggest that it was a helpful thing. It was helpful to anybody.
Right. Forgive me. Carry on.
Indeed. No, you're right to pull me up on that. I think language matters here, Brian, and I wouldn't want to do that. And then the second thing is long COVID. 100,000 Scots, maybe more, could be suffering this devastating condition, which we have very little in the way of provision for. It's actually, I think you'd be better off if you're suffering from long COVID in Scotland by moving to England, where they actually have dedicated long COVID clinics, they have peripatetic long COVID nurses, and a treatment pathway that we just don't have here. We have a couple of online pages, a helpline, and whatever your GP can do for you. This is possibly one of the most disabling events since the First World War, and we haven't woken up to that. It doesn't feature anywhere in the recovery plan. And the final thing I'll say is this about the inquiry.
Very brief, if you would.
Yeah, we just need to let this go where the evidence takes it. There should be no parameters imposed by Parliament which stop it getting to the truth.
Patrick, what's your take on the inquiry and the future plans for the NHS? It's not going to be under your direct ministerial remit, but what's your take?
Well, I mean, this discussion started with Cockab and Stephen saying how much they agreed, and now it sounds like we're violently agreeing with each other. That the agreement is expressed with the same kind of animosity as our worst disagreements sometimes. There is a huge amount of common ground here. Not least because we've all been personally affected, just as everybody else in the country has. Politicians aren't immune from that. I remember right at the start of this, Nicola Sturgeon standing up and saying, I will get things wrong. We as a government will get things wrong. And I honestly would defy any of us here or anybody else in politics to say that we could have gone into this and never made a mistake. So undoubtedly, mistakes will have been made. I think there's the problem with the inquiry, and yeah, there are longer standing issues before COVID, absolutely. And one of the things that the inquiry is likely to find is that most governments around the world didn't do pandemic preparedness planning properly, didn't learn the lessons of some of the countries in the Asian countries that had dealt with MERS and SARS and so on, and had learned from that. We didn't apply that properly. I mean, all of our pandemic planning was based on flu variants. So there are some long-standing mistakes here. But I think part of the problem with the inquiry is that it's going to need to both be big, bold, and looking at things in a very deep way, but also drilling down to very narrow specifics. It's going to need to be both looking at the Scottish government and the domestic context here, but also at the wider context within the UK. It's going to both need to take years to do long, detailed work, and it's going to need to report soon on issues that we'll be legislating on soon, like the care system. So it's going to need to do all of those things. I suspect it's going to have to take a phased approach and focus in narrowly on some specifics first of all, and not be expected to do everything all at once, because I think that would be an impossible task.
Will you be supportive, even though it's not in your ministerial remit and there are exclusions, etc., and exceptions? Should it go through and should you become a minister, will you feel the need to be supportive of those ministers who may face criticism for their actions as a result of the inquiry? Will you feel the need to support the health programme generally, or will you be reserving the right to be critical where you feel it's appropriate?
Well, there's a great deal in health policy that isn't in the shared programme. Our shared programme does include a lot of investment in mental health, for example, but it doesn't cover the whole of health. So on those issues, we'll continue to work together in good faith and try to reach agreement. And only if we absolutely can't, we'll add those issues to the excluded issues within our agreement and ultimately agree to differ. I think that's a reasonable way for political parties to operate in a constructive way, in good faith, but ultimately disagreeing where they have to. But supporting ministers who have been found to, they've made some errors of judgment, or they've made mistakes, if that's what an inquiry finds, supporting a minister in that case may mean supporting them to learn and to draw on that as experience to become better. Or if there's an issue of direct incompetence or of breaching the ministerial code, they may frankly need to be supported into a different role in public life. That will be a judgment for the First Minister, whether someone has breached the ministerial code and not done their job properly. But that's always the case. And the idea that this ceases to be about learning lessons and trying to improve ourselves and becomes just a blame game, I think that would be serving the interests of the party political game, but I don't think it would be serving the interests of the public.
Well, let's talk about the interest of Scotland for the future. I'm going to bring in Alistair Grant here. Alistair, one thing that's mentioned right at the top of although I'm slightly sceptical about its impact, but mentioned right at the top of the agreement between the SNP and the Greens is that they want a referendum and they want it within this Parliament. Explain that to us, if you would, Alistair.
Yeah, so I think this will be one of the things that certainly journalists will be looking out for when Nicola Sturgeon sets out her programme for government in the coming days or weeks. I think all eyes will be on what she says about independence, any legislation on a second referendum. So obviously, as you said, the SNP Green Deal pledges to secure that referendum after the COVID crisis, although it doesn't really define what it means by after the crisis.
Yeah.
It says it will be in the current parliamentary term, current parliamentary session, and that if the crisis had passed, the intention would be to hold it within the first half. So that's kind of before 2024. And in the background, we've also got these kind of same unanswered problems and questions that we're all kind of very used to now in terms of what would happen if the UK government says no. And if they do say no and Nicola Sturgeon kind of pushes on regardless, whether this is going to end up in a constitutional battle in the courts and what would happen after that. So it's hard to tell where this is going to go.
Stephen Kerr, is it your belief that the UK Conservative government will continue to say no to the idea of there being Indie Ref 2?
I think the Scottish Conservatives and I think the UK government will continue to focus relentlessly on recovering from COVID and the pandemic, Brian. I mean, at the end of the day, we've had this very long and passionate discussion about the NHS. I mentioned the economy at the start of the podcast. We've not gotten to schools yet, but I know that's something that COCAB and I feel very passionately about. The whole scenario of where Scotland now sits and where we want our country to be means that we cannot be diverted into divisive referendums. And even the debate about a divisive referendum will be divisive. And frankly, you know, I actually do agree with some of the stuff that was said earlier. I really do, Patrick, about us working together. I want us all to work together in order to better the lives and life prospects of the people of Scotland. I also want us to work very closely with the UK government on things and not make constitutional grandstanding part of the basis for whether the Scottish government decides to work with the UK government, for example, on the connectivity review and so forth. Scots don't rate, Brian, this issue as something that should be commanding the time and the energy of MSPs and indeed MPs. They want us focusing on the things that are bread and butter issues that matter to them, like the future of our country is defined by the education system that we need to restore to being fit for purpose after the pandemic, and in creating an economy where there are good jobs, high-paying jobs, where our people are educated and trained and capable of filling those jobs and driving us forward as a country, because Scotland, strategically and uniquely, I think, can play a massive role in delivering net zero for the UK. We've got so many opportunities. Thanks. We've been blessed with this wonderful country and all of its assets. We need to work together to make sure that we do the best we can for our own country, but also for the planet. And
thanks, Stephen.
That's far more important than an Indian.
Let's bring in COCAB Stuart. COCAB, presumably you feel that this wonderful country, as Stephen describes it, I'm sure you would share the description. You feel that this wonderful country would be better served by a referendum leading to independence.
I do. However, I also agree with Stephen that at this moment in time, the COVID recovery is essential. That's the most important thing. There is no debate about that. Whether you're an independent supporter or not, COVID doesn't see the difference in that. So that is the priority. However, I don't think that it is as divisive as Stephen is making out, because you can do both. From what I can see, there are plenty of sort of like ministers. There's 129. There's loads of folk there, and the population out there as well. There is optimism about coming out of this pandemic and sort of like, building better, recovering better, learning from where the cracks were, and not just papering over them, but actually sort of like having a renewed vision, for our country. And for me, I do think that's independence. So I think we can do both.
What if
both is in the country? Stephen was saying that there isn't the appetite for it. There is. In May, people voted for the SNP. They voted for the Greens. Those are two, parties that have got independence there right on the table.
I'll bring in the others in a second. COCAB, what if? You say they shouldn't. You say they should be holding a referendum. But what if the Conservative government, and I stress that the Constitution is reserved to the UK Parliament and the UK government, what if the Conservative government continue to say no? Where do you go from there? Where do you take it?
Well, that exposes quite sort of like obviously the paternalistic attitude that's taken by the UK government, that we still think
they don't
that
care about that.
How can they say no? We have sort of like, if this agreement, this cooperation agreement is agreed, goes forward, and it works in the consensual way that we're working, that situation becomes impossible to sustain. So let Boris say that. Let him say that.
Alec Cole-Hamilton, furious shaking of head from the leader of the Scottish Lib Dems.
It's not impossible to sustain. It's impossible to stand up. I mean, if you look at the arithmetic of what actually happened in the election, fewer than 50% of the voting public actually backed parties that were in favour of independence. Not only that, but Nicola Sturgeon recognised that the consistent drive towards a mandate for a second referendum was harming her during the polls, and pivoted 3 weeks out to who do you trust to lead Scotland through the pandemic. That mandate is tainted. And I know many people who voted SNP because they didn't want to change a wartime cabinet as they saw it, a crisis government. They didn't want to do that at this stage, but they weren't endorsing her plans for separation. And we need that like a hole in the head. CoreCab says, oh, there's plenty of us. We can do other things as well. Well, no, it's starved our policy of oxygen for the last 10 years. It's why there are warning lights flashing across the dashboard of public policy in Scotland. And why? Because ministerial attention and interest has been focused on one thing and one thing alone. And the final thing I will say is this. There was a poll of Green Party supporters before the election, which actually shows that more than half of Green Party supporters do not support independence. I will be looking aghast at this deal and be thinking, what on earth has this got to do with tackling climate change? That should have been the centerpiece of a coalition.
Well, they'll have a chance to vote aghast on Saturday. Let's bring it. They'll have a chance to vote aghast on Saturday. Let's bring in Patrick Harvey. Patrick Harvey, are you confident that a referendum will take place on independence during the lifetime of the present Scottish Parliament?
Well, first of all, I think Alex is quoting from an Ashcroft poll, which we all know was a heavily skewed sample and has been blown out the water in terms of its credibility. But the idea that the UK government simply says, no, you can't, as their only answer to the aspirations of the people of Scotland to make a decision about their future, the idea that no, you can't is the only answer, I just don't think it stands up. And the other point that we've heard, and Stephen made this point, and I'm sure he made this point in good faith. I don't doubt his sincerity of saying it. Why can't we just work together with the UK government? Well, the UK government is now routinely legislating in devolved areas which are none of their business without the consent of the Scottish Parliament. It's passed legislation to undermine the existing powers of the Scottish Parliament. So we no longer even have the devolution settlement we voted for more than 20 years ago. And they've taken the Scottish Parliament's legislation to court to try and strike it down just for implementing things like children's rights, which are wholly devolved. So the idea that we can work together with them when they have refused point blank to put meaningful intergovernmental machinery in place, I just don't think it's credible.
Well, Patrick, same question. Hold on a second. Same question to Patrick that I put to CoreCab Stuart. If the UK government continue to say no because they say it is not in the interests of the Scottish people and the governance of the United Kingdom, what do you do?
Well, there are different legal opinions that have been expressed about whether a referendum bill could be passed without a Section 30 order. I don't want that to get to court. I don't want that to get to court. It could do it in time. I don't want that to happen because the way it should happen is by just respecting the democratic process. If this issue can be resolved democratically, then how can it be resolved democratically when the people of Scotland have voted for pro-independence majorities in both their parliaments repeatedly? What on earth are they supposed to do in order to have this resolved democratically?
Brief follow-up, Patrick. Do you? I mean, you were voting previously for a referendum anyway, but if you are in government, do you believe it makes it more likely that there is more impetus behind? Does it make a difference to the case for independence referendum? Does it strengthen it in your view?
I certainly hope it does. And, Scottish political landscape has shown itself capable of innovation, new ways of governing on several occasions. This is another innovation. And I hope that stability that it will create reinforces the case for the democratic will of Scotland to be respected. But that case is already there with the pro-independence majority in Parliament. Simply put, no Democrat can really resist it.
Okay, I'll bring in Martin Whitfield and then the others.
I was just really going to comment in respect of something that Patrick has said and sort of invite the hope that within the next, month, 6 weeks, the Supreme Court will hand down its decision on the UNCR implementation bill. Will the Greens fight to make sure that we've got legislative space so that any parts that are struck out can be redrafted, inserted, so it can become law as fast as possible?
Very, very brief answer, Patrick, and then back to Martin Whitfield on the wider referendum.
I very much hope that won't be necessary, but if it is necessary, then yes, all political parties should work together to find the most effective way of making sure that those rights are enshrined in domestic law.
Thanks. Back to Martin. Where are we
Absolutely.
on the referendum? Martin Whitfield, on the need for a referendum.
And quickly, with regards to the referendum, I think when we look at the NHS publication, where they're saying quite categorically that treatment centres aren't even going to come online until the second half of this Parliament. This Parliament needs to concentrate on COVID recovery. We need to look after our young people. We need to look after those people in work. We need to look after our older people. And we need to look after the environment. We have the COP meeting coming up in weeks. Now is not the time. And with the greatest respect to Kaukab, and it is with absolute respect, I have yet to see this government deal with more than one thing at the same time.
Yeah.
Alec Cole-Hamilton, you're nodding there. Alec Cole-Hamilton.
I think, well, that goes back to the warning lights that are flashing across the dashboard of public policy, whether that's the educational attainment gap, where it's the missed the missed climate change targets, the delays to the extension of funded childcare, the threadbare state of our police force, GRA reform. This government pushes back the issues that are hard, and it focuses constantly, relentlessly towards the drive of separation. And this is harming our citizens. There is a muscle memory, Brian, to the politics of Scotland, where every single vote in every election is now about a mandate for a second referendum. It has become the alpha and the omega of political debate in Scotland, and we aren't getting on with the business of government. And I really hope that the people of this country start to see both of these parties for what they are, that this is the primary reason for their existence, and will vote them out in the next election.
Stephen Kerr?
Yeah, I have to say I agree with much of what I've just heard. I mean, I have never underestimated Patrick's political skills, but my goodness, that was spinning like a spinning top on a sixpenny piece, and all that stuff about how the Conservatives are legislating in devolved space and all the rest of it. And he knows full well why the UK government needed to take the steps it did in respect to the legal advice that the Scottish government and the Parliament had about legislating in areas that are actually reserved. You cannot legislate in a devolved Parliament for the behaviours, actions and expectations of UK ministers. But I'm a Democrat, absolutely a Democrat. I believe in our democracy, and I'm going to be absolutely frank with you. I knock on a lot of doors even now, and I do not have people telling me that this is the biggest issue in their lives. What they're talking to me about are the things that I listed earlier on. They care passionately about the future of their children. They care passionately about the NHS and the NHS workers. And we've had some...
Alec, yeah, go on, Stephen, very briefly.
No, but the reality is that in the DNA of the SNP, in the DNA of the Scottish Greens, they are absolutely obsessed with that issue. It trumps, if I may use that word, it trumps every other issue that the people of Scotland care about.
If you're a Democrat, they won the blasted election. Shouldn't they get their way in that regard?
What they should be listening. What the election result, Brian, says is the people of Scotland want their politicians to work together to tackle the issues that arise because of COVID. They want us working together to fix the things that matter to them.
Alec Cole-Hamilton, you want a brief intervention, and then Kaukab Stewart. Alec first, please.
Thank you for bringing me back in. Yes, both of these parties, Brian, are asking to vote in a blank check referendum. This is a referendum for which there are so many unanswered questions. It's like Brexit all over again. The Brexit prospectus was written on the back end of a bus. Independence is no different. Nobody will tell us who is going to pay the pensions. Nobody will tell us what currency will we use. Nobody tell us how long it will take us, if at all, Scotland will take to get back into the European Union.
The Sturgeon says Holy History we placed in a white paper at the time.
But we
know about the last white paper, don't we?
The last white paper did not contain any of these things. And what's more, if she did, and I would welcome sight of some of these answers, because then we could debate them in open ground rather than waiting until we were in the teeth of a referendum campaign and having people so confused and bamboozled by hundreds and hundreds of pages of white paper they don't know what they're voting for. I think that's the true travesty of democracy in this discussion.
Very briefly, Stephen.
Brian, that'll be the white paper that said Scotland's economy was built on oil and gas. That'll be the white paper that is now filed very firmly in any library under the fiction section.
Kaukab Stewart.
Well, yeah.
Kaukab, please. Go for it.
Stephen, you just said about people voted for the fact that they wanted the parties to work together. That's exactly what we are trying to demonstrate here. And yet you were complaining about the fact that that doesn't work for you either. So, you can't have it both ways, and you're trying to have it both ways every time.
No.
The narrative of this sort of divisive, ripping apart, all of this kind of talk, I have to say that, out there, people don't see it that way at all. They see Scotland pulling together to try and recover from this pandemic, find Scottish sort of like solutions from our own sort of perspective. We have a right to do that. We have a right to be recognised democratically to do that. You're a Democrat. You've said you're a Democrat. So therefore, to honour the democratic will of the people, that, to me is good. And Alex, I won't be taking any lectures from you about, people not entirely voting for independence just because they're voting for Green or for SNP or whatever. Sort of like, I don't like to say it, but the results for the election for your own party were not that healthy. So you need to sort of like take a reflective attitude on that tack that you're taking.
I can't believe you're deploying
that was a
as an
bit
argument.
brutal.
Oh, that was wonderful. I don't like to say, but here we go. That's the style. That's
Also, Corkap,
I
can I
was-
also
I
point
was
out
just-
that
out of time. Final word to Patrick Harvey. Is there going to be a referendum in this parliament?
I was just really delighted to hear Alex demanding more information and more urgency from the Scottish government on independence.
having
I'll
none
tell
of
you
it.
what, mate. I'll do my best to G them along a bit. How's that?
Please do, and then we can have an open debate about this and show what
Another
ridiculous
podcast
idea
looms.
this
I can
is.
feel it.
Another podcast looms, absolutely. Another podcast looms next week. Thank you very, very, very much to Alistair Grant, to all the participants in the debate. That was absolutely superb. Remind everyone that subscription, 20% off an annual subscription to all the many, many manifold outpourings from the Herald. Use the code HeraldPod2021 and you get a fifth off. Can't say better than that. From me, Brian Taylor, toodaloo the new.